Hi, in this three-part series, we're going to be investigating and really analyzing the movie Good Will Hunting. Good Will Hunting, I think it was 1997 it came out. It won an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. It launched the careers of Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. It obviously had Robin Williams co-starring in the movie. It also launched careers of Minnie Driver. So it was an enormously successful movie, and it's a very unique film. And in this three-part series, we're going to look at three aspects to what makes this movie unique. First of all, we're going to be looking at how the subplots and all the different relationships, in other words, all the characters, how they interweave with and associate to the main character, because there's a number of different characters at play in this movie. In fact, if we look here are all the different plots. So there's the plots of the main character, who's played by the Matt Damon. He's the Will Hunting character, with his friends. Then the situation where he gets arrested by the police. Then we have the Minnie Driver character. We have the math stuff at MIT. We've got the professor, and then, of course, we've got Sean. So these are all different plots and components of what makes this story work. So the first thing we're going to do in this video is we're going to look at how these plots all come together and really try to understand and get a better understanding of how to use subplots within stories, including your own stories. In the second part of this series, we're going to actually explore the thematic ideas that are at play. Because if we see there are relationships between the main character and his buddies, the main character and the Minnie Driver, her name is Skylar, her character, the main character and what's going on at MIT and the professor, and then the main character and the character Sean. And in the final part of this, we're going to then look at how structure pulls the whole story together, and how the structure, which is the sequential order of events, aligns the story in such a way to make the magic really happen. And what's unique about this movie, and unique about what we're going to be looking at, how these subplots and thematic layers and structure works, it's not an actually unique movie at all. All great movies work very similar to the way Good Will Hunting works. But let's start by taking a look at Good Will Hunting. And with this video, we're going to take a look at the subplots and understand how all these different plots come together and create the incredible movie that we see on screen. Now, what's unique about this story is when we look at the poster of the movie, notice what they do. We've got all these different plots taking place. We've got his buddies, and if you go watch the movie, if you're not familiar with it, he spends a tremendous amount of time in the film hanging out with his friends in bars. Of course, then you've got the Skylar character. She becomes a major subplot, if you will, of the story. We've, of course, got the fact that he gets arrested and that he is potentially going to end up in jail. So that's a major part. In my system, in your storytelling potential, if you're not familiar with it, we always talk about the idea that there's two major flowing realities or stories that flow into any great film. We call one the A story and one the B story. And the B story is actually the ongoing life and reality of the main character that would have occurred no matter what happens, whether that A story comes along. So this part of the story is what we would call the B story. This is his own ongoing reality. Even though the Skylar character comes along during the course of the film, that would have happened regardless of what happened over here at MIT. And what happens over here at MIT is what we call the A story. And what we have is he solves this math problem, gets discovered by this professor, and the professor then bails him, gets him out of jail essentially, doesn't bail him, but gets him like a relief from having to go to jail, and he has to do therapy, and therapy then brings in this Robin Williams character. And what's interesting about that is that the whole movie is framed around this therapy. And of course, if you go watch the movie is fundamentally about this relationship. Of all these plots, this one plot is the real emphasis of the story. But how do we get here? Over this three-part series, what we're going to do is explore a better way to think about stories, and that's what we teach in your storytelling potential. We explain that there is what I already explained, that there's a B story and A story, then there's the character, there's a theme that swims into view, if you will, that this thematic layer that binds the whole thing together, and that's going to be part 2 of this series. We're going to explore how this theme works, and then we're going to understand a better way to think about structure, that there is this B story that flows into the reality, and there's an A story that runs parallel to that B story that's going to converge, and then we're going to see that there's something called a character wave, and this is where real structure happens, and a better way to think about structure. The problem and what this resolves is you've probably learned about structure with some kind of timeline that looks like this. What this timeline is showing you is a very standard way of thinking about, like, you've got your setup, right? The main character kind of comes into some kind of situation that's taking place called an inciting incident. And then there is plot points, a plot point, the midpoint, another plot point. There's ascending action. The line goes up to eventually get to a climax, and everything gets resolved at a climax. And this is a very, really two-dimensional way of thinking about storytelling. Now, obviously, there are also subplots. So a very popular way to think about subplots is you take that thick, major plot that's taking place, and we look at it like this: Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3, and then along come subplots that kind of come off of that, and then there might be subplots that come off of this, and subplots that come off of. And what ends up happening is if we were to try and think about a movie such as Good Will Hunting using these two ways of thinking about story, this and this, we're going to see that the order of events kind of works into something like this, and it's not to scale. I'm just showing what we have. We introduce the main character with his buddies. He solves that math problem. And I'm not saying this is a summary of what happens, right? He solves the math problem. He gets arrested. At some point along this line, we introduce the subplot of the Minnie Driver character, the Skylar, right? And then we've got we introduce the professor gets involved with the Will character. He's introduced way back here at the setup as well. And then we eventually get to the Sean character, and that's going to flow, of course, into the climax. Now, here's the only problem with this, thinking about a story like this. First of all, it's all two-dimensional, thinking about your story in a linear fashion. But there's a big problem, and that's this relationship here. The professor and the therapist becomes a major part of this story. In other words, as this story is progressing, he gets arrested, he now has to do the therapy, and the therapist then reaches out to the character Sean, the Robin Williams character, and then Robin Williams ultimately does the therapy. So this relationship is between two characters that Will fundamentally has nothing to do with, right? He's a relationship to both, but their relationship is really unrelated to the main character. Now, what's important to think about is we've got the main plot, what I call the A story, which is the Will character gets caught doing the math, right? And he's forced to now do therapy because of the fighting. So in other words, without the fight, see, he gets caught doing the math, it just is what it is. He could just say F you, as he does in the story, and he can go on with his life. But we need the fight. The fight forces his hand. He's going to go to jail without the fight. Because of the fight, he's going to go to jail. And what that does is it forces his hand. He has to do what the professor wants. He has to do the math, and he has to do the therapy. But no matter what happens, the professor brings him to a number of other therapists. They all don't work. So then he brings in Sean. So again, that's where we get this relationship. But the main plot is the boy and the math and the professor. This relationship is the main plot. And what happens is because of the main plot, we then introduce the plot between the professor and the character Sean, the Robin Williams character. This is a subplot, right? What kind of plot would this be? How do you classify this plot? Right? This is a pretty significant plot in the story. This is the main plot, and obviously everything to do with this would be what we'd call the main plot. Then what is this? If not a subplot, what is it? And if this is a subplot, when we go back to this timeline, should we put this down here? Does this belong over here also, this plot between this character? The problem gets more complicated because guess what? This plot, which is a subplot, creates this plot between the Robin Williams character and the Will Hunting character. This whole plot, which is the whole point of the story, right? Let's go back. The major plot of the story, the emphasis of the poster, the whole point of what the story is about is not only is it not the main plot, which is this, not only is it not a subplot, it's a subplot of a subplot. You have to hear this because if you want to write truly great stories, if you want to be able to write a great novel or a great screenplay, understanding this image is critical. Because I will promise you, I could show you movie after movie after movie after movie, and we will find a pattern of plots that look like this. And we need to understand what's going on here because here's the problem. If we take our standard timeline and we try to understand this using this traditional way of thinking about plots and subplots, we'll get to a point where everything becomes a subplot. Here's the main plot, his friends, the math, the fight, he gets arrested, and then the professor gets involved in, and then Skylar gets introduced, and then we got the relationship between the Sean character and the professor, and then we get to the main plot all the way down here. All the way over here is the main plot, and then that eventually ends up at the climax. And what should the climax be then? If you know the movie, you know the climax is about this. And the climax is about this. But how do we get there? The images that you're shown by experts about storytelling don't even show that subplots make it to the climax. They play out the subordinate, supporting storylines, and then they end. But that's not what goes on here. Skylar is a major part of the ending. The whole ending, he's driving off to California to go see about a girl. This fight between these guys. They're going to go have a drink at the end. Major plot, before he drives off the girl, and then he says goodbye. They have all these subplots. These three plots are all at the climax. Subplot, subplot, subplot of a subplot, which is actually what the story is all about. And this way of thinking about stories, this line with this, or a triangular rising line, a straight line, is a fundamental flaw, a fundamentally incorrect way to think about storytelling. What actually happens at the end of Good Will Hunting? Well, let's take a look. So now let's take a look at the ending sequence of this movie, Good Will Hunting. And what's amazing, if you pay attention, not at what we are seeing, pay attention to what plots we're not seeing. And I will tell you right now, you will not see any plot that has to do with the professor in The Boy Will Hunting. Not one plot is about that main plot of the story. Rather, what we're going to see is all of those subplots play out. We also see that the storyline of his friends, which is really how the movie starts for Will himself. It's about him and his buddies, and that he has now gained the confidence and the ability and the trust in other people to go and really be a successful, at least a potentially successful person to take on the world and not be afraid of the world, which, as we're going to see in the next part of this video, is the theme.
Not there.
And with that shot, we end the relationship with the friends.
If the professor calls about that job, just tell him, sorry. I had to go see about a girl. Will.
Son of a bitch. He stole my line.
And with that shot, we end the relationship with the therapist. And then we're going to stay, the movie will now linger on this shot of him on the way to California. I think it's Route 90. It goes from the Boston area out to California, San Francisco. So that's what that would be, Route 90, I think. And he's on his way to go see Skylar, the girl. All the subplots. So I'm going to stop this now. So we'll stop this and go back to the presentation. Let's minimize this. And we'll go back to here. So look what is going on. The main plots are all over. The fact that he got arrested. The fact that he did the math stuff. The fact that he was forced and all that. That's all over. At the end of the movie, all the main plots are gone, and all that's left are the subplots. This line, this way of thinking about storytelling, subplots specifically, is completely 100% wrong. It's not the right way to think about it. So what's a better way? Because how do we get to the fact that the main two plots at the end is the professor, the therapist, and the girl, which were two plots that weren't even there at the beginning, the last two plots. And this is the problem with thinking about stories like this. And the better way to think about this, rather than to think about a single line that is constructing your structure, we think about stories differently. We understand there are many plots, individual plots, flowing into your story from the past. Flowing in. This timeline, this dotted line represents the beginning of the story you tell. If you're writing a novel, it's when you write chapter 1. If you're writing a screenplay, it's right when you write fade in. That's that line. But before that line, there's all these stories that are flowing into the now. The professor and the math stuff and the MIT, it exists before the movie begins, and it flows in, and we pick up at a point that's going to be really relevant. We're going to line up these stories to make them very relevant. And we have the Will character flowing in, and we've got all the different subplots. In fact, what we can do then is construct and understand our subplots as individual storylines that flow in. We've got the Will and his friends, the B story. We've got the professor and the MIT math stuff, the A story. We got him solving that math problem, which then leads him to getting arrested, which is not represented on this image. We have that arrest scene, which then has that storyline. We've got Skylar, which has that storyline. And then because he's arrested, now we bring in the relationship between the Sean and the professor character. And we've got that storyline, which ultimately leads to the main focus of this story. It's not always, it could have been a different story that was the main story. And what's interesting is when we really look at this story, this one in particular, is the math stuff is only a few minutes of the total screen time. Then it's not a movie about math and science. It's literally like maybe 5 minutes of the whole entire movie is the math stuff between the professor and the Will character. Rather, what the movie's about, his friends, the girl, this relationship. It's about this relationship more than the math stuff. And of course, it's about Will and the Robin Williams character. And then this then lets us identify which plots are going to be the ending, what it's going to focus on at the end. And that's the power of thinking differently and more uniquely about storytelling. And then we expand it out even more to really understand how these storylines all come to a climax. And what happens at that climatic point is where we end the math stuff. When we end the arrest stuff. Those two storylines, the math stuff and the climax of the arrest stuff, that ends in the climax zone. Then we get to the resolution where we resolve all the other stuff. The friends, the girl, the therapist. And then we get to what's something called reveal potential. Notice how the movie ended. It ended with him on his way to go see about a girl, which was something that he really didn't understand until he had the relationship with the Robin Williams character. And the Robin Williams character, again, I expect you to hopefully be familiar with the movie when you watch these videos, but if you're not, has a situation where he's actually a widower. His own wife of many years had passed away within recent history of the movie. And he has his own issues with his own relationships. And he has his own story about his wife, and that's another major part of the story. And what we then need to understand is instead of thinking about the character arc, right? This is the way, and I just made this image, is that you've got that's traditional rising single plot line idea, and then the character arc somehow changes over the story, and different experts will illustrate different points of the change as it's happening. Rather, again, what we call it is a revealed potential, because the potential is already there. And I found this on a website on the internet from somebody who claims to be an expert at storytelling, specifically screenwriting, and he's explaining the character arc, and he literally uses a mathematical equation in his explanation of the character arc. This is an image trying to explain the character arc. I hope you understand that just the term is just semantics to explain some kind of movement through time of the change. It's not anything to do with math. It's nothing to do with even an arc. There's no actual arc. It's a term, a descriptive term. It's not a mathematical equation. This is not a proper way to think about a character arc. And I know so many experts and professionals really try to think about the character arc as some kind of arc, but it's really just a transformation, and it doesn't look anything like an arc. And for sure, it looks nothing like a mathematical equation. The better way, and what we teach in your storytelling potential, is we use the concept of a revealed potential. Because when you really think about the truly great character arcs, think about Luke Skywalker. Luke Skywalker always has that potential of the Force. He has the potential to be who he is. And the same thing goes for Harry Potter. It's unrevealed. They don't know about it. And what happens during the course of the story, as the story flows through the now, through the reality of the story you're telling, what's revealed to them is what their potential is. And that's exactly what happens in Good Will Hunting. It's no different. It's no different than Luke Skywalker learning about who he really is, what his potential really is, and what he can potentially do with the Force. That's what happens to Will Hunting. The potential's there. It has to be unlocked. And that's the whole idea of the girl. The girl Skylar, is that he doesn't know how to have a relationship. He can't trust a relationship. And we're going to talk about this a lot more in the next video, the next part of the series. Like I said, this is part one of what's going to be 3 parts. This is part one. We explored subplots and thinking differently about subplots, thinking about multiple storylines that enter into your stories at the same time, and how they all converge to create the amazing story that is shown on screen or told in your novel. It's just a better way to think about stories, because you think about each storyline independently, not in a timeline. And that's what we teach in my book, Your Storytelling Potential, the underground guide to finally writing a great screenplay or novel. Also my software Plot Control for writing incredible movies, deep, relevant, thematically rich movies. Chapter Control for doing the same thing with novels. And of course, my software Episode Control for developing, writing, producing incredible TV shows. And in the next part of this, we're going to actually start to dig into my software Plot Control as we explore how to use the software to specifically develop your thematic layering of your stories. And we're going to take all of these storylines. We're going to go all the way back, but this is good enough. We're going to take all the way, let's go here. We're going to learn how to take all of these stories that are flowing really independent of each other, and we're going to see how they are actually all thematically linked. What makes these stories relevant to each other, these different stories that are flowing through the now of your story, what makes all these stories relevant to each other is the thematic layering. They are thematically linked. They're fundamentally, at the deepest roots, about the same things, all these stories. And that's what we're going to explore in part 2 of this video series, exploring the movie Good Will Hunting.